Baruch Haba b'Shem Hashem, b'Shem Irgin Shir. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's issur from Rabbi Yakov Smith Shlita, Tapuche Adom Halacha, potatoes and halacha. To have the great source sponsoring issur, call Irgin Shir 718-851-8651 or email ist@yeshivanet.com. Rabbi Smith.
It's always a chizik when we learn new shilas and you see the truth of what the Mishnah says, hafach ba, the kaila ba. Even though there's no Gemara, there's no Rishonim, but that's the breitkeit, the reichkeit, the Torah, everything is there. Believe it or not, today's sugya, potatoes and halacha, is pretty much a new shaila. As we'll see, it's not mentioned in the Gemara, Rishonim, not in Shulchan Aruch, and yet there's an array of questions you have to deal with. Hilchos brachas for Pesach, Hilchos Shabbos, Hilchos Pesach, Hilchos Kashrus. And as we'll see, these are all negei l'maisa, and we find it challenging because there is no Gemara or Shulchan Aruch. What's also challenging, and that's really, you have to know before we start the sugya, that potatoes is different than any other vegetable botanically, mitzias. Some vegetables grow on a bush, like tomatoes and peppers, so that's a bayer pri adama. There are some vegetables that are referred to as root vegetables, carrots, parsnip, turnip, radish. It's basically in the ground, and it's a root. The onions is also a bayer pri adama, but it's a bulb. Mushrooms, as we'll soon see, is a shehakol. It's not really a vegetable. It grows from the air. Potatoes is referred to as a tuber. Now, you don't have to know too much about that, but it's more like a stem than a root. Now, actually, the tuber means that it stores the nutrients within, and that's why it's able to grow in any country, cold or hot. We'll soon see about that. But basically, potatoes is different than any other vegetable that we have. So it's not a Gemara, and it's not a typical vegetable. So here we are challenged. What bracha is it? Is it kitniyos? Is there an issur bishulakum? And many other halachos, basically how to apply halachos to the potato. So what you do, like you always do, you try to find an earlier source. So let me read to you what the Maril is quoted in the Maril and the Menhagim, Hilchos Erev Yom Kippur. It's Amud Shin Yud Test in the standard prints. Now the Maril lived, pardon me if it goes a date, but we'll have to use that today, in the mid-1300s. And the Maril is quoted as saying the following. First, Maril writes that the established minig, which the Ramah quotes in Tov Reish Ches Siv Dalit, that on Erev Yom Kippur, by the Suda, we're supposed to eat, we have to avoid eating things that are mechama mesaguf, pardon me, that could bring a person to tumah balayla, because Chas v'shalom on Yom Kippur, that would be a tragedy. And then the Maril adds, his minig was, he ate a pre-shakarin aired apple, which sounds like potato, k'dei liskarer lihishamar, minikiyas. In other words, we avoid foods that warm the body, so maybe it's a ma'ila to have foods that cool the body. So the assumption is that potatoes is mekara esaguf, which is beneficial on Erev Yom Kippur. So it sounds like the Maril ate potatoes on Erev Yom Kippur. So why did I tell you it's not found in the Rishonim? Maril was one of the Rishonim. Because the assumption is that aired apple, the way we teach it today, is another word for kartoffel, which is a potato. So we do find it in the Rishonim. No, but this, of course, is very hard to accept historically. First of all, this is what I'm telling you as facts, that the potatoes were first discovered came to Europe, certainly in the mid-1600s. It became popular in the 1700s. And as we proceed, you'll see that the person that speak about it first are the Gedolei Yisrael in the 1700s. The Pri Megadim, Rabbi Yakov Emden, and the Chayodom. Now you wonder, it was discovered. What is it, like electricity, or it's like a cell phone? You have to invent it? Not at all. The metzius is potatoes. I guess always was, but who gave us the wisdom of finding in the ground something that's almost impossible to eat as it is? So who said you take it and cook it? You could eat it. Plus, there's another catch, that being that the potato is part of the nightshade family, it's really toxic, it's poisonous to a certain extent. Now the potato itself is not poisonous, but the leaf, the plant that grows out of it, which we see, if you ever see potatoes grow, above the potatoes are in the ground, and there's a sprout that grows up through, and you could see it above the ground. That leafy part is slightly toxic. So people were scared to eat potatoes, until someone ate it, and he cooked it, and he enjoyed it, and he survived to tell the tale. So people started eating it. But this is the metzius, this is the historical fact, and it's muchach from all the poskim, that until, again, the mid-1600s, it was not used. And the maril never had a potato. Also, potatoes is a starch that's machbid esaguf. It's heavy. It's not mekara esaguf. And also, erd apple, you have to think about why is erd apple potato? I mean, an apple is a biblical word, we find it in Nach. But what's the shaykh between a potato and an apple? They're round, very shvacha dinyan. So the truth is, we call it the puchi adama, but like hagufa. So really, it's a little hard to believe that the maril ate potatoes. But the plot is thickening. There's an Elio Rabbah, one of the Gedolei Achrayim, in Tafkuf Pei Gimel Siv Dalid, and regarding Leil Rosh Hashanah, there's a whole procedure how we eat on Leil Rosh Hashanah. So he says, and I quote, "Maril hayanoig lechel erd apple." He used to eat an erd apple on Rosh Hashanah night. Why? Kihu mekara umayneya mihergel dov. Oh, so far so good. L'shitosei. Apparently, this erd apple that's good for Erev Yom Kippur is also good Rosh Hashanah night, because you want to stay b'tahara on Rosh Hashanah. Fine. Then he adds, "V'hayimavarach olav." He made on the erd apple shechianu. Apparently, it was a new crop, and Rosh Hashanah we make a shechianu. So he made a shechianu on a potato, but on an erd apple. Good. V'loi bayer priyadama, but he didn't make a bayer priyadama on the erd apple. Because don't forget, he already washed, and something that's part of the suda, you don't make a bracha. Now, when you eat the pomegranate or the tamarim, that's a dessert food, you make a bracha. But erd apple is part of the suda, so he made a shechiyanu, but not a bar piyadam. Oh. So this is packed with information. Erd apple, mekarer, that we saw from the maril. Making a shechiyanu on erd apple is a chiddush, and also the bracha is bar piyadama. But it's also packed with tzarech iyuns. First of all, like we asked, erd apple is not makara. And Maril didn't have potatoes, how could he eat it? But what's also a new kasha for this part of the shir, that we know halacha, the Ramah says in a Reish Chafei Sivav, that you only make a shechianu on a seasonal fruit, that's a new crop. Some vegetables that really grow a whole year, and Mr. Ruhr explains, like a potato, erd apple, it's not seasonal, there's no shechianu. So how could Maril make a shechianu on an erd apple, which is a potato? Now, I'm not asking a kasha on Maril from the Ramah, because Maril is 400 years before the Ramah, but as the Kiva Ege asks on the page in Reish Chafei, how could the Ramah say, you don't make a shechianu on an erd apple if the Maril made a shechianu? So Kiva Ege asked it, the Teres Chaim and Tafkuf Pei Gimel asked it. So now we have another kasha. There are some Yidden Adar II that make a shehakol on a potato. Now, if erd apple is potato, Maril made a hadama, except when it was Toich Suda, right? So how could you make a shehakol? Are you arguing on Maril? So I decided I have to figure this out. The El Rabbah is quoting Maril. So let me look at Maril and Hilchas Rosh Hashanah and see what he says. Which I did. It's page Reish Ayin Zayin Amag Maril. And it's the same thing like that Rabbi says, with one major difference. And I'll quote, Maril noag lechel kishuim. The Maril ate kishum on Rosh Hashanah because it's Mekara, and he made a shechianu, but he didn't make a bar pri adama. Oh, he does not say erdepel, he says kishuim. Now, obviously, this makes the whole sugya lichtig. Rabbi say kishuim we have in the Gemara. Remember Shaimek kishuim? So they had in times of the Gemara and times not real. Kishuim is a seasonal vegetable that you make a shechianu. Kishuim is mekare saguf. But now we have one problem. The Maril and Hilchas Erev and Kippur said erdepel. And here in Rosh Hashanah he says kishuim. You know what the simple teretz is? You're making one big mistake. Erdepel is not a potato. Erdepel is a cucumber, kishuin. So now Shalom al Yisrael, Kivegas kashas for enfit. You don't make a shechion on a potato, the Ramah is right. But kishuim is a regular seasonal vegetable. So the El Rabba assumed that we know how to touch the word erdepel, interchangeable with kishuim, not with potato. But now we are back to square one. So we have absolutely no information about a potato, which makes sense, because Maril in his lifetime never saw a potato. I want to mention that Rabbi Sari Develitsky, one of the Gedolei Eretz Yisrael, in two places in his Svarim, he writes that he thinks that really kishum are more closely related to aftichim, to melons. In fact, it's interesting, the Dashon, the Shotza, in his Hagoyis on Hilchas Rosh Hashanah, he teaches that you're supposed to eat a Rosh Hashanah the kishuim, which is vasamelon, which is watermelon, which is even more understandable because that's taka makara saguf. And they're taka yidin that are makbid and Erev Yom Kippur, they have melons, watermelon, because it's good for the body to avoid chas v'shalom tum b'layla. So, but lamaisa, potatoes, it's not. So then I found a real matziyah. The Torah's Chaim of Chaim Seifa, on Tofkuf Pei Gimel, Taka asked Rabbi Kivegas Kasha, he must have not seen that it's Kivegas Kasha. How could, Shechianu, the Ramah says not, and the Mayol says yeah. And Imam says this Yisoid, that the erdepel is not a potato, it is kishuim. And therefore everything stems. Now I must mention before we apply this Mola Maisa, the Heilige Chafetz Chaim in Sharatzi and Reish Chafei Sif, Cotton Chav Gimel, is bothered by Kivegas Kasha. How could we say that there's no shechion on potato on erdepel potatoes? The Maril l'chari made a shechionu. So he says efsha. Now I don't think he's saying ruach hakodesh. I don't think he's paskening. He's saying maybe this is the metzias. Maybe in the times of Maril they had very little use of potatoes. Now let me explain something. Why taka is there no shechion on potatoes? Because potatoes is what they call in English a no-fail enterprise. Potatoes, you can't go wrong. You plant it in the ground, it grows in warm climates, in cold climates. In fact, the two, almost the biggest countries that are involved with potatoes are Russia and Ukraine. It grows anywhere. You can keep it in the ground for weeks, for months, it stays. So people plant it and replant it a whole year. So that's why there's no shechianu. But so the Chafetz Chaim says maybe in Maril's time they first found it, but only used it occasionally, so it was a seasonal fruit, and therefore you make a shechianu. Okay, that's what he says, maybe. But he's not saying it, that's the Metzias, he's not saying Ruach HaKodesh, but the other poskim seem to have assumed a whole different understanding. Erdepel is not potatoes, and there's no shechianu on potatoes, never was. Maril didn't have potatoes, so we're more comfortable to say that Lamaisa, Erdepel in Rishonim wording is a cucumber, maybe it's a melon, but Lamaisa, we don't have in the Rishonim anything about potatoes. Now, this explains, Taka, why there's no stira. Now, just before we go weiter, sweet potatoes are, even though they're the same name, are different. First of all, sweet potatoes were found much earlier. They say Columbus discovered it in the Caribbean, so it goes back 200 years before regular potatoes. And that sweet potatoes happen to be more of a root food than potatoes. Also, Lamaisa, it needs a long, warm growing season. So therefore, Lamaisa, it's interesting that it's not really similar to potatoes regarding this regard. But I found interesting, I had to do a little homework, that today in Ivrit, modern Hebrew, what's the word for sweet potatoes? Batatas. Now, it's interesting, the word, when I read a little bit about the sweet potatoes, the original word, I'll quote, is about these sweet potatoes. It's words I can, the word that's used it's from the batatas family. Pomia batatas. Must be a Latin word. So I guess the one that made up modern Hebrew did his homework, and he found batatas 500 years ago, so that's why. But it's not a hamish of art, the kitza, batatas. It's an old, probably a Latin word. But anyhow, it's basically grows in the ground, but it's more similar to radish and carrots than potatoes. Now, we'll soon see why I stress that, and let's apply this lemais, and we'll try to organize it al pisei the Shulchan Aruch. First of all, what bracha rishayna do you make on potatoes? So the emphasis, it's not like tomatoes that's clear-cut boyer pri adama, because the tomatoes grow from a bush, this grows in the ground. It's more like carrots and radish and parsnip that grows in the ground. But still, it's eligible for boyer pri adama. In fact, it's probably more literal. Boyer pri adama, it grows in the ground. So why not say that it's like a root, even though it's not, it's a tuber, but it's enough similarity to make a boyer pri adama? And again, I'm not going to tell you I found the Gemara or Rishon or a Shulchan Aruch because there's not mention in any of those. They didn't have it. The first one that I found, the earliest, is Rabbi Yakov Emden in the Siddur Yavitz, in the new prints, the 2-volume prints, Chelik Aleph Ambatov Kuf Yud Beis, and he taka lived in the 1700s. It stems everything historically, and he says on kartoffels you make a boyer pri adama. The Nesivus in the Siddur Derech HaChaim, Dina Berchas Hanenin, also says that potatoes is Adama. The Mishnah Berurah in Reish Beis, Yitkot Mem, also says so. But what I found, I guess, a little more convincing, Rav Moshe in Chelik Aleph Siman Samach, someone asked him, how could you make Adama on potatoes? The potatoes is more like the root, and the plant that grows out of it is like the pri Adama. So you should make a shehakol on the potatoes? The Moshe says, what are you talking about? The issur is not the plant that goes out of the potatoes. The issur is the potato. That's the issur peri. So avada, you make a hadama on potatoes. Now, if someone will say, why don't you bring a raya from a maril? I remember learning a maril in Hilchas Rosh Hashanah that on ered apple he made adama. He didn't make adama toich suda because he washed. Is mashmi, but it's not toich suda. What bracha do you make? Hadama, so you're right. He made an Hadama on an ered apple, but as we explained, ered apple is a squash, not a potato. So we can't say it's Rishonim, Gemara, or Shulchan Aruch. We found the later Achrayim beginning with the Yavitz. However, Kayadua, there's a minik to make a shehakol, and we have to understand why. So the first suggestion is based on the Gemara in Brachas Daf Mem, where the Gemara says, besides Pri Adama, Kamein or Pitriyos, I'm a shehakol. On mushrooms, and pitriyos really are truffles, which is probably one of the most expensive foods today, type of a mushroom. As the Gemara explains, even though it seems like it's growing from the ground, it's really growing from the air because it grows on non-ground surfaces also. It grows on a tree. It grows anywhere. In fact, the proper way to define a mushroom is a mushroom is a fungus. I know fungus sounds dangerous, but this fungus is edible. But there is a pella. I mean, not that they need Chazal don't need arayis. Rabbi Yoina on that Gemara in Brach is Daf Mem, and I quote: "Pitriyos is gedalim be'etzim v'nikroim balaz fungus." Fei vav nun gimel vav sin. Mamish, the word fungus. If it's a sin, like it's not a shin, but even if it's a shin, fungus, but lamaisa close enough. Because mushrooms are a fungus that grow from the air, not from the ground. So it's not a boyer pri adama. So the suggestion was that maybe potatoes also is a type of a fungus. Because you see that if you're cleaning for Pesach and you find the potato in the dark recesses of your cabinet, it has eyes coming out of it and it has a plant coming out of it. So maybe it's taka fungus. And taka the Kaman and Shulchan Ator, Reish Dalid Gimel, very, very emphatically says on Kamei and Shvemlach and Pitriyos bulbis. Rather, I should mention bulbis is another word, a Yiddish word for potatoes. Typically used by the Litvisha, but he has also used this. He says Pitriyos bulbis. you make a shehakol. Why? Because it grows not from the ground, it grows from the air. And Itakas quotes that word fungus, that it's not a bar priyadam. So he's learning that potatoes are a type of a fungus. Now this is really also the shita of the Rav Shitza, who also held that potatoes is a shehakol because it's like kamena pitrios. It also has been added that the Aruch, who was from the earliest Rishonim, I realize was the latest Rishonim, right? The Aruch was one of the Baliyatoisis, times of Rashi. In Erech Peter, like Pitriyois, he says that mushrooms, kemeyin, and tirtufoli. So some say tirtufol is like kartoffel. So the Aruch already seemed to allude to the fact that potatoes, kartoffel, is a shehakol like kemeyin. Now that's a pliya, because the truth is the Aruch is a Halach Sefer written by one of the Baliyatoises, but the Yiddish words were added by a maskil in the year, at the exact year, in Tafkuf Ayin Tes, and in all the earlier prints of the Aruch, there's no Yiddish words. So a maskil put it in, so why would we bring a raya from a maskil? But the emes, the maskil had potatoes, because Tafkuf Ayin Tes was the early 1800s. But to bring a raya from the Aruch seems to be incorrect, because the Aruch didn't write the Yiddish words. But what's also hard to accept is that lemetzias potatoes are not that fungus. The Orchis Chaim, the Spink and Reish Dalet Beis quotes from the Sefer Ma'orei Or that very much rejects this, and he says a potato is not a mushroom, and he says that the Ikka Gedula is from the ground, and he says that those that say that a potato is a mushroom, it's wrong, factually wrong. And he says even betzolim, onions have the sprouts coming out if you leave it for a long time. And what's most convincing, the Stipler in his Kraina de Igrasa Chelik Beisim and Peiches, he writes very emphatically, very emotionally. People say to ma'oid, ma'ani, how can you say it's a potato shehakol? He says, he quotes the Gemara in Chul and Pei Zayin. The Gemara says about Beribi, who's a Gadol Adar. So you might be a Gadol Adar, but you don't know anything about chickens. That's the famous quote in the Gemara. Stipe writes, you might be a Gadol Adar, but I know about potatoes. I grew up in Europe with potatoes. I saw fields full of them. They grow in the ground like every other. It's talking not like a tomato, but he says it's like the other vegetables, like merin, retach, like radishes and carrots. In other words, it's like a root, but it's definitely not a mushroom. To me, a gedolev and a raw, people bring a raya from the Aruch. He says it can't be. It's a regular Borei Priyadam. So that's one reason that is quoted, that's why it should be a shehakol, but again, in the Metzias, it's hard to accept. But there's a second reason, more of an halacha reason, and that's based on a totally different reasoning. The Gemara says in brachas, and that's the way most people pass in Maisa, that on rice, even though Zachameshes mean a dogon, but since rice is so filling, it has the halacha of a Chameshes min dagan, and the bracha rishayna is boire min mezainis. Rabbi Yoyin in brachas aflam zayin, and the Bialacha in Reish Ches Siv Ches the Sharatzi and Sivkat Lameral quotes this lahalacha that it's lav dafka rice. Any other vegetable or food for that matter that's filling and that's svia, that's the main svia, could also be a boire min mezainis. Potatoes in our times is certainly a candidate to be like that. You know, you have to realize that they didn't have it in earlier times, but when they started using potatoes, it became a person's ikkasad, ikkasvia. I read something that Mamash is amazing, that for hundreds of years there were famines, people died from starvation in Europe. When they brought potatoes to Europe and they started using it, the population in Europe doubled, in 100 years doubled. That means instead of people dying, the population doubled, because that's how much food potatoes brought. But there's no doubt about it, like the Welt says, the potatoes were the chaye adam in all those years. So maybe we should say that a potato, because it's the ikas svia sa'adam, should be like rice, and it's a bori mina mezainas. Or maybe you'll say, who gives you the right to say that? Do you know that how much was written about corn? From Seif has a tshuva and Archaim Simen Nun, about corn should be like bar minim mezainis, because in some countries they didn't have wheat, they used corn. They made challah from corn. So maybe corn's a mezainis. Teretz says, who said we have a right to change halacha? It doesn't say about corn, it doesn't say about potatoes. They didn't have it, but the Maisa doesn't say. So maybe we should do misafik like the Taz in Reish Ches Yud Aleph says regarding rice. And we should make a shehakol. And that's why not mezainis, because we're not sure, not hadama, make a shehakol. And indeed, there are those poskim that say, based on this reasoning, potatoes, because it's so important, might be mezainis, it might be adama, so maybe make a shehakol like some do on rice. Now I was wondering if you have a suffix mezainis and adama, make a adama. So the teretz is like the Taz says regarding rice, but it could be even more than that, because maybe we still have a suffix of shehakol of shvemlach. Lamaisa, this is the reason why some make a shehakol. It's first of all, maybe it's like mushroom, then also maybe it's the ikka food like rice, and therefore it's a suffix mezainis. Le'idach gisa, there are poskim that reject this. It doesn't. Who said we have a suffix? The Rav Klein in his Shuvas Chelevav Lametes Mem very strongly proves that it's hadama. The Nidbru and Yud Aleph Mem Ches, he says that Takasam follow the minig of their Rabbeim al Amunas Chachamim. But for us, we live on this world and we see it grows from the ground, not from the air, and therefore the bracha is bar pri adama. But those Talmidim or Talmidim of the Rapshitza, the Sanza, and those dynasties continue to make a shehakol because that's their minig. So minig Yisrael Torah for them, and those that make adama, that's minig Yisrael Torah for those that make an adama. What's interesting is that the B'tzela Chochma, Chelik Vav Simen Pei Gimel, was asked by an enikl of the Rapshitza that he went through the sukkah and he felt uncomfortable making a shehakol on potatoes. Could he change his minig? And I was surprised because we don't change minhagim, but he proves that this is something that you could change the minig. And he alludes to that, but the truth is the Munkach, even though he came from Talmidim of the Sanza, in Darkei Chaim V'Shalom, it just writes simply, he made a hadam on potatoes v'lo shehakol. It doesn't elaborate, but I imagine he changed the minig because he should have been making a shehakol. So he's basically saying that if a person feels like he wants to make hadama, that's not considered a shini from minig avoisa. What could be an interesting nafkamina lamaisa, let's say a person was a little famished, whatever, he made a bari mina bezoinais on a potato. And his minig is always hadama. Or his minig is shehakol, but he made a bezoinis. Is he yoytze b'diavad with a bezoinis on a potato? So based on the above, we could say, la yotze midei safik. Because some consider that it's a bezoinis chatchila. But the truth is that argument is not convincing. For most of us that make hadama, it's a vadi hadama, it's not a suffix mezainis. So what do you mean now you're relying on mezainis? But there's a much more convincing argument that b'diavad you yaitzi with the mezainis. Because there's a chiddush at the Kesef Mishnah in Hilchos Brachos Perek Dalet's Halacha Vav, where the Kesef Mishnah says a chiddush, but he says it, that if a person makes a mezainis on any food, b'diavad could be his yaitza. Except if he makes it on salt or water. Because lamaisa, almost all foods are amazing. So mezainis is not wrong. Maybe it's a little, exaggerated, because only chamesh mina dagan are fully mezin, but then again, an apple is mezin. So he says it's almost like a shehakol with every food, on every food. So this is the shita of the Kesef Mishnah, and that's followed by the Chayodam and the Birkei Yosef, the Bialocha, Rav Moshe, Chayil Daltz, and Mem says Lamaisa also like this, that b'diavad, if a person is mezainis on any food except for salt or water, b'diavad he would be yoitz. Now the truth is, the carrot, we could also argue. If you tell me a raya, look, shehakol, you yoitz every food, very good. But shehakol, yoitz every food is a Mishnah in Brachos Daf Mem. We don't find that Mishnah, Val Kul Mamam Mezainis yoitz. Why not? Maybe taka, shehakol is very general, but it's not too big. Maybe mezainis is too big, it doesn't fit. Lamaisa, the Steichemet in Hilchos Brachos, Aleph, Lamed Vav, the Achashulchan, and Kuf Samach Zayin, Yutes, all say even b'diavad, you can't be yoitza with the mezainis on other foods. So our shaila, if someone made a mezainis on potatoes, we can't say he did the right thing, but b'diavad you can't repeat the bracha. First of all, maybe mezainis is the right bracha, maybe it's like rice, and more so of the svara, lamaisa, most poskim hold mezainis covers every food, and potatoes is included. Now, where this is very negeya, I want to preempt the shailas. Every Rav has this every Pesach. Someone comes to him, he feels terrible. He made a mezainis on Pesach cake, which is potato starch, and basically a shehakol. So instead of making a shehakol, he made a mezainis on his cake, like he's been doing for 11 months for 12 months till now. So Lamaisa, that will say we could rely on the shita. Rabbi Yoyin is shita shtickle, but the ikka on mezainis al chol davar. Rabbi Shlomo Zalman is quoted in the same bracha, page 411. If you make a takadama on potato starch items, mezainis on potato starch items, you'll be yoytze b'diavad, which is basically, I guess, relying on the Kesef Mishnah. The bad news is, if he made a mezainis on cake, he's yoytze b'diavad. But if he made an alamichya on the cake, which is shehakol, that says beferish, it's kamat beferish in Shulchan Aruch reish ches with gimel, but it's beferish mamish in Mishtur reish beis nun hey, that alamichya is too big for anything but alamichya, and even b'diavad you're not yoytze alamichya on Pesach cake. Now, raw potato is basically, I can't tell you it's in Shulchan Aruch because they didn't have it in Shulchan Aruch, but in Reish Hey Sif Aleph, the Mechaber says on a vegetable it's supposed to be eaten cooked, and you eat it raw, you make a shehakol. Rather, some of the Mishalim have changed in recent years. It used to be on raw carrots and raw squash, you make a shehakol. Today, raw carrots and raw squash are eaten as is. But raw potatoes, as of yet, are still not eaten raw. I mean, sushi has changed our whole way of looking at life, so maybe they're going to sushiize potatoes also. But so far, potatoes that are eaten raw are shehakol. That the Kleismaker says that also in that tshuva, the Rayatzis in Pei Beis, I forgot to mention, has a beautiful tshuva talk about the minig of making a shehakol on potatoes. It goes through both reasons, ayin shah. Now, a big sugya of potatoes is the bracha on potatoes that have been changed. Potato kugel, latkes, mashed potatoes, powdered potatoes. So basically, it seems to be a beferish Gemara. The Gemara says, not regarding potatoes, obviously they didn't have potatoes, but regarding any fruit or vegetable, Zaktamar and Brachis Lamites, prima rabu or prima zutta, whether it's a big slice or a small slice, is irrelevant. As long as the original potato, the original fruit or vegetable is there, even if it's a thin slice, the bracha is the original bracha. In other words, basically, it doesn't have to be recognizable to the person's first vision. If it's still that same fruit or vegetable, you make a bar priates on a thin slice of apple. I don't know what it is. It looks so thin, but it's still the original fruit. Now, and that's why on potato chips, potato sticks, French fries, there's no suffix. The bracha is bar priadam. But the question is when things have been significantly changed, lamashal, potato kugel, latkes. So now we have a different sugya. In the Ramah and Reish Beis Siv Zayin, based on a Trumas Hadeshim, discusses the following. If you take an apple and squeeze it out to get apple juice, that's a beferish Gemara, you make a shehakol. Because that's not the fruit, that's Zeya Ba'alma, that's the juice. But the same Gemara says, you take an apple and you crush it, you make a boirei priya. Gemara's talking about a tamarim, but we're saying apples. But on crushed apples, it's a boirei priya. Zot Trumas Hadeshim. But let's say you crush it so much that there are no pieces. Really, you should make a bar priates, because right in front of you is the whole apple. It's very different than you squeeze the apple and you only have the juice but not the fruit. This is b'mosayu kaimi. This is the original fruit. But says Trumas Hadeshen, I'm not so sure. It might be kedai to make a shehakol when the fruit or vegetable was completely pulverized, pureed, or liquefied. Now, but the Machaba does not go with that. And the Machaba seems to hold in Reish Beis Zayin, even a applesauce that was completely liquefied, the bracha is bar priates. The Ramah quotes Trumas Hadeshen, it's only a suffix, make a shehakol and be suffix. But the Ramah adds, if you made a bar priates on any applesauce, even the one that was liquefied, you yaitz b'diavad, because the ikka bracha is bar priates. So now the question is, to apply that to kugels. So charetz pashut. If you have kugels that have strands, typically you grate it and there are pieces, even if it's pri mezuzah. But pri mezuzah is still bar pri adama. But if you have a kugel that was made from completely pureed or blended potatoes and there's nothing recognizable, then the bracha should be a taka shehakol, like the trumas hadesha. I remember when I was in yeshiva, they used to say it's a machlekes or a Moshe Rabbi Yakov what the brachas make on kugel. But then we realized that it's not a machlekes or a Moshe Rabbi Yakov, it's machlekes Rebbetzin Moshe and Rebbetzin Yakov. Because one of them, I forgot which one, but this is the truth. One of them made potatoes by using a grater, like the babas, so there were pieces. One of them used those days, the modern blender that liquefied it. So then the bracha is a shehakol. So it's not a machlekes amol, just a metzias. Someone told me when I said this, someone told me he used to work in one of the biggest kugel manufacturers. He told me the way they grate the kugel, it's mavel arai in the machinery. But to put it bluntly, when they wanted to transfer the kugel from the big machine that grated it to the bekelach to make the kugel, they used a water hose to transfer it. So you could be certain that kugel is a shehakol. But the truth is, even if lamaisa, a person that makes adam on that kugel, yizicha yoytza. But lamaisa, Rav Shlomo Zalman in the same bracha, the Shevet HaLevi in Yud Mem Vav, and Rabbi Yashiv in Gimel Lamed Beis, all say typically, almost always, kugel has or latkes have pieces. So the right bracha should be a bar pri adam. Now the chiddush which you have to appreciate, but if you think about it, it's understandable. Mashed potatoes, as early as the yavitz and the sid I mentioned, and the mishru that I mentioned, mashed potatoes all agree is a bar pri adam. Because it's not really that it was liquefied or pureed. It's basically soft and it was mashed. It's like a person sits on a soft potato and he flattens it. So it's not a different bracha, it's just reshaped. So mashed potatoes is always a bar pri adam. Now, someone said a svara, maybe potatoes, even if it's liquefied, is still a bar pri adam. Why? Because the same trumas hadeshin that says that something that has changed, the bracha changed, he says, but if it's planted and it's only used when it's transformed, so then fakir, when you eat it as it is, it's inedible. When you transformed it into a powder and made of food, then the brach is bar pri. Now what is he talking about? There was a candy called humlaisa made from besamim, cloves. Neglach in Yiddish, right? They took that and they grated it, they added sweeteners, and they made a candy. Now, cloves grow on a tree, but you can't eat them plain. The only way to eat them is to crush them and make a candy called hamlaisa. Shumzadesh says, on that hamlaisa candy, you make a bar pri. It was made into powder, but that's the way to eat it, and it was grown for that, so the bracha remains bar pri. So the Ber Moshe in Chelik Beis, Siman Yud Beis, Yivkat and Hey suggests that maybe all kugels and all latkes and everything is always adama. Because potatoes are planted at daita to make latkes or kugel. Now, the truth is, maybe in Borough Park and Flatbush and Lakewood and Muncie, potatoes are used to make latkes and kugel. But if you look at the world, which typically that's the way you're looking at daita hachi, potatoes are not grown to make latkes or kugel. And I did my research, and it's not made to make it to a different product. Potatoes are eaten as it is, or French fries, but it's made to use as it is. So it's hard to say that's svarv, not the adaita hachi. So we're back to what we said. If there are pieces noticeable, it's adama. If there's no pieces, then it's a shehakol. Now the big question is powdered potatoes, which means you're traveling and you want to have instant potatoes. So they sell powdered potatoes and you add water and mix it and becomes something like the mashed potatoes. So you have to know how it's made. The metzias is they take regular potatoes and they cook it, and then they dehydrate it, take out any water, and there's a big amount of water in potatoes, and then it's like a very hard golf ball, that size. And then they crush it into powder, and they tell you, listen, we took out water from this potato. We want you to put back this percentage of water, and it should be mashed potatoes. The world of Gilgulim, this is mamash a Gilgul. They took out the water and you put it back. So Rabelski told me to heard from Rabbi Zechariah Levracha, who said when I heard the Shaila, Bimilsayu kaima kedemikar, a quote from that Trumas Hadeshin. In other words, if you tell me that they took out water and you put back water, but lamaisa it ends up back to potato. Now, this is all, of course, emes and svar. The question is, if you ever tasted powdered potatoes, it doesn't taste like regular potatoes. So it's hard to understand that should be Adama. And Taka of Nisan Karelitz and Brachas Kuvches and Taka of other Paiskim say, if it's like a regular potato, fine, but a mice it's different. So it's hard for me to say this, but all the Heintig, the Kutim all quote one from the other that it's Adama. But if it doesn't taste like potatoes, then it's a newly recreated. You have two shehakols. You have water and potato powder. So it's hard to make Adama on powder and water, which both are not potatoes. Now, Lamaisa, Pringles, which is, of course, a potato chip, officially. So I don't have to tell you, a regular potato chip is a vade bar pi Adama because it's prima zutta. Pringles is not regular slice of potato. They don't have engineers crafting the Pringles that it should all be stacked one on top of the other, obviously. They take potato powder with other ingredients and they recreate something called Pringles. So, again, the quote is that's potato chips. They recreated potato chips. But again, it doesn't taste like potato chips. You might say it's better than potato chips. It's fine. But it's not potatoes. And I want to tell you what I received the correspondence from the Pringles company, and they admitted of the entire Pringle, only 42% of it is potatoes. The rest of it, the 58% of it, is wheat starch, corn and rice flour, spices, and flavoring. So it's not even a potato. So how can you make Adama if it's only 42% potato? So if you'd ask me, I would say to make a shehakol on Pringles, and that's pashut. Again, the Heintig Paiskim all say, the Heintig Likutim all say Adama because one follows from the other, but again, it's hard to believe that if something only 42% potatoes, now you might say it's better than potato chips, fine, but that doesn't make it a potato out of a not potato. It's pashut that there's no shechianu on potatoes, that's the Ramah Mishtabur. You might one day find, Mariel says in Hilchos Rosh Hashanah that he made a shechianu on erdapple. Rabbi says that erdapple was a kishuin. Now, lamaisa, sweet potatoes is interesting, that I asked a few people, I hope I'm right, but even those that make a shehakol on potatoes, on sweet potato, is a bar pi Adama. And the reason for us is masik midvash, zil basataima. Potatoes is the ikka sviyas adam. Sweet potatoes isn't. Also, sweet potatoes is more like a root than a tuber, and therefore it doesn't have the suffix of being like mushrooms, so therefore sweet potatoes, all agree, is a hadam. Moving on to Hilchos Shabbos, I should mention, this is a common shayla, a person has to get something from the cabinet, but there's a bag of potatoes or a raw potato in the way. So he wants to move the potato to get to the food. So that's a problem, because the Mechaber says in Shin Chesif Lamed Beis, even foods that are typically edible, but if they're right now raw and edible, like raw fish is muktzeh. Raw meat, today akapanim is muktzeh. Raw vegetables that can't be eaten are muktzeh. So Rav Moshe is quoted as saying that raw potatoes, since they're inedible, are muktzeh. And if it's muktzeh, it's not a klisha malachta le'issa, obviously. It's muktzeh machmas gufay. So there's no head to even the tzara gufa mekoyma. Moshe added, if you have a behemoth and you feed your behemoth potatoes, no, then it's meichel behemoth. But typically we don't have that. So therefore there's no head of even the tzara mekoyma. Someone told me a chiddush that he said, it's not a chiddush, deserves that word chiddush. He's always this child about moving potatoes, and sweet potatoes the same thing. So before Shabbos, he's miyachid all his raw potatoes and sweet potatoes that there shouldn't be muktzeh. I said, what does that mean? Yichud is not like a chant or a skula. It's a reality. You're miyachid it to use it. You can't be miyachid it to move it. You know, if you have an animal, you decide to give it to the animal on Shabbos, that yichud helps. So yichud will not help, so move it before Shabbos, and then you'll have no problems. Now, it's Basher, someone asked me the Shaila Punk, I was learning the sugya. He wants to take a potato from the cholent and mash it and give it to the child. But it was Shabbos, and you know, toichin, Mr. Brewer says we should be choishish for the shita that even toichin to feed right away is also on Shabbos. So how could he mash if mashing is a form of toichin like many shitas? I know some hold not, but let's work in the worst scenario. If toichin is also even lechol miyad, and even if mashing is toichin, is there any heta on mashing a potato? So here the Shmir Shabbos involved Sif Tes, quoting of Shlomo Zalman, says that if the mashed potato is so fully cooked, we could almost look at it like it's already mashed as it is. And rather earlier in Vav Zayin, he quotes of Shlomo Zalman that gives the Hagdara that if you pick up a carrot, so you pick up with a fork, so you pick it up. Sometimes you pick up a potato that's so fully cooked that when you pick it up, the fork breaks the potato. It doesn't pick it up. It's not solid. It's like almost like a mush as it is, and it falls apart. So Shlomo Zalman said, if you have a soft potato that's so fully cooked that you can't even pick it up as it is, it falls apart, we look at it like it's already mashed. And there's no issur toichen, acha toichen. So if it's negeya to feeding a child, this would be an example where a potato has the halacha like a mashed potato, which really effectively is one and the same, and therefore there's no issur toichen. Moving on to Hilchos Pesach, the question about karpas, which vegetable to use for karpas. So I remember still like yesterday, I was in 8th grade, one of my Rabbi said that karpas, what's the min to use? Very pashut. Rosh Tevis, carrots, radish, potatoes, and celery. Which stems very good, but of course there's more to it. Because karpas is really a word. It's not Rosh Tevis. And the Chassam Sofer and Mavel de Ketshuva in Archaim, in Kuf Lamed Beis, says his Rabbi Amnasan Adler was miyageya to figure out what is this karpas. Taka any vegetable is kosher, but what's the chazal? What do chazal really want in a karpas? And he says that Lamais the Mariel, since Mariel says to get it, we try to get it, and he said it's an afya, celery, and basically what he said was that afya, which is the word for it, is the Rosh Tevis kale, poel, Yeshua is ot. Of course, kale is with an aleph, but so afya is kale, poel, Yeshua is ot. And that's why the Chassam Sofer preferred celery. Lamais, I should mention, in Arabic, Adar II, the Arabic word for celery is karpas. So it's very meduyik that the mehudar of karpas would be celery. Now, Lamaisa, some people use potatoes, the Shulchan and Taf Ayin Gimel. Sif Yud does mention this as an option. But obviously there are some reservations. First of all, if you hold that potatoes is a shehakol, so it might not work. So some have a minig on Pesach, they make an Adam. But the emphasis I have a shtickle of a chab. If you use for the morer, the real McCoy tamcha, the chrein, the horseradish, it might be not a bad idea to make a shehakol on the potato and pat of the morer. Let me explain. Because we make adama on the karpas to pat of the morer. For those of us that use horseradish, the white root, the oldest question is, you're making adama on the karpas to pat of the morer. What bracha do you make on raw horseradish? Just bite into a stalk of horseradish. Which the Brewer says, quoting earlier Paiskim, if you do that for the mitzvah, it's a sakana ve'eina mitzvah. No, maybe the only bracha should be dayan emes, but not more. But zichan an adama. So how can you have adama on the potatoes, pat to the morer? So I once said that there, maybe it's emes also, because why taka is a raw vegetable shehakol, not the original bracha? Because you're not using it in the best way. It's not derech iluya. You're supposed to cook a potato before you eat it. But twice a year, morer, if you cook it, you're not yoytz the mitzvah. The way to use the horseradish is to eat it raw. So maybe it's the original bracha of Bayer Pri Adama, even though it's raw. But if you want to be very creative, you make a shehakol on potato, you have in mind to pat the morer, it's a good shidduch. 2 shehakols. The only problem is your children will not believe what's going on. Because they learned since they were young, you make adam on the karpas, so I don't advise it. But that's one issue with the problem of the potato being a shehakol. There's another reservation I must mention. Rav David, in his God the Kol Goydi, points this out, that the Bach and Taf Ayin Gimel, Pri Megadim also quotes this, B'Shem the Maril, why do we have karpas? Because karpas is a ma'or taivas achila, it has that acid in it, and we show we're rich, it's a derech cheres, but we're ready to take on, we're going to have a big meal, we're going to stimulate our appetite. The metzias is that celery and any radish and all those vegetables that are used typically are ma'or taivas achila. Potatoes is not. Potatoes is a starch. So it doesn't seem to conform with that reason al kapana. There's another issue in Hilchos with potatoes, and that is basically we wash for the karpas, because really it's tibuli b'mashka, and takatasi we should wash a whole year, but this Pesach we wash for the vegetable. If you use a potato, it's not pashut, you have to wash even the rest of the year, or ever. Because the basic klal is whatever you eat with your hand, and now it's wet, you have to wash. Potatoes is the one vegetable of the all other options that typically eat with a fork. So even if you eat it with your hand, there's no chiyuv til sedayim. So it's not going to work to use a potato and then wash your hand. It just doesn't work. The other vegetables have a mile. But the Chayyim recognize that as a minig, so we would say that yisoid, if you have that minig, that's the minig some have, but again, it's a much later minig, which came about in the 1700s. But that's the beauty of this sugya. Something like this would say in the Rishonim. But all of these, thoughts are basically, not heintig mamish, but from the 1700s and beyond. The next question, which is much more challenging than it seems, is the question why, or maybe is kitniyos included, is potatoes included in the issur kitniyos? So let me give you a little background. Kitniyos is an issur chama ma'od. The pois can say, unless it's pikuach nefesh, we can't be mekel. Kitniyos, din ha-gemara, is perfectly mutter. Achenu asfardim ada yoyim eat kitniyos. So what's going on here? So there are a few reasons, but the two main reasons for kitniyos is, number one, in the beans they mixed in flour, which is chametz, so you might come to eat chametz. But another reason is that the kitniyos was made into flour, and it was used as a product from flour. And if 1 year you have kitniyos products, next year you're going to have wheat product, which is chametz mamish. So anything that's used as a flour form was asal kitniyos. Now the question is, why isn't potatoes included in kitniyos? We have potato starch, potato flour. Many people live on Pesach with potato flour. Now, the truth is, it's not a legume like kitniyos, but then again, if corn is asa, because corn is a flour, why isn't potatoes? And the Chayyim in Klal Kuf Lam and Nishvus Adam Siman Chaf does not say it's asa. People misquote him. Look at the Lashon. He says in the year Tov Kuf Lam and Aleph, again, historically everything stems, 1771. There was a heard of a certain country that had them in Ashkenaz in Germany, that the minig was not to eat potatoes because of this isvara. He calls it bulbus also. Everything stemmed, the name and the history. The Yavitz in Shilas Yavitz Beis Kuf Mem Zayin Dalet says in Mannheim, also in Germany, they wanted to ask aired apple, kartoffel, because they make kamach out of it. Mamish, it makes sense when forming with the yisoid of kitniyos. And the Prima Godim in two places, Taf Nun Gimel Aleph and Taf Samach Dal Aleph, also mentions aired apple could be included in the issur of kitniyos. But Lamaisa, Poik Chazi, minig oil is to eat potatoes and even potato starch. The Imtoima Maishne, there it could be very pashut for us. Kitniyos is an issur chama ma'od, but it's not a Gemara. It's a Go'ainim and Rishonim. Rav Moshe in Chele Gimel, Samach Gimel was asked about peanuts, which is more of a legume than potatoes. Is it included in the issur of kitniyos? So Rav Moshe goes and he discusses why kitniyos is asa, because Chazal asked those minim. And Rav Moshe says, I'll prove it to you. Because there's nothing that should be asa like potatoes, which is a thing that you make into powder. But they didn't asa it. And if they didn't asa it, we don't have the jurisdiction to asa it. Even though in Seichel it should be asa. And Rav Moshe says, now they started using it, why don't we issur it? He says, well, maybe they can't, they needed potatoes, or maybe the whole chumrah of kitniyos is a chiddush. But Rav Moshe's stance is that if the Chazal didn't issur it, we can't issur it. Oh, now it's masik midvash. Potatoes first entered the world, be'erach 1700s, 1600s. That was a few hundred years after the Go'ainim issur kitniyos. So it was never included in the issur. We cannot, on our own, include it in the issur. Now the Yavitz in that tshuva, and again he quotes his father very forcefully in Morikatzia, that says he didn't like the whole minig of kitniyos, and they should mevatel it and abolish it because people end up eating chametz mamish. So that's another reason. But at the end of the day, potatoes in svara should be, but it's not asa because it never was asa in the first place. And taka, like one gadol said, Baruch Hashem, they didn't have potatoes in times of Chazal, otherwise taka would have been asa. But Baruch Hashem, it wasn't. Now moving on to the last question of bishulakum, which I hope to do. It's a big sugya, obviously, but at least with Negel and Yanenu, bishulakum is something that only on foods that need cooking, that are not nechol chai. The guy cooks water, it's mutter. It's only foods that need cooking, and a food that is oil al shulchan malachim. Now both of those you need a shear to describe, but basically, let me just tell you very clearly, potatoes are not eaten raw. And all agree, potatoes, at least when the Chacham's Adam's time, he writes, Beferish Samach Vav Dalid, potatoes are oila al shulchan malachim. So oy bazoi, if a guy makes potato soup or he makes smashed potatoes, it should be us als bishulakum. The Shulchan in Kuf Yud Gimel Yud Ches, 100 plus years after Chacham's Adam, he says in our time these bulbis are dalas ha'am, only poor people eat it. It's that was called for many generations the poor man's food, and therefore it's not oil al shulchan malachim, no issur bishulakum. There was a god lechad Chachmas Adam that said it is, but today it's not. But what's interesting is both the Chachmas Adam and the Aruch HaShulchan stress clearly that this is what they're talking about in their times because things change. Oil al shulchan malachim, it depends on the country. And that's why I could tell you that in Tafshin Pei Beis, or actually I found this a few years earlier, all the Gedolei HaPoskim b'Pei Echad write, Rav Moshe Netshuva, and Rabbi Yakov, Rav Shevet HaLevi, Rav Sternbach, all write that potatoes today are oil al shulchan malachim. You'll say it's very inexpensive, so what? L'maisa people eat potatoes. So there's no doubt about it, if a guy makes potatoes, mashed potatoes, potato soup, it is also bishulakum. The only question is, potato chips, Pringles, or French fries, are they included in the issur of bishulakum? Now, what's the shaila? Because the truth is, everybody agrees that French fries are not oil al shulchan malachim. Everybody agrees, l'chayra, I mean, certainly more so, that potato chips are oil al shulchan malachim. I have in front of me a quote of a letter from the White House executive chef. They asked him about foods, which is oil al shulchan malachim. So he says, we serve the guests whatever they want. Typical democracy, whatever they want. But one thing we never served is potato chips. So potato chips is not oil al shulchan malachim. No doubt about that, l'chayra. So now we have a quandary. Because potatoes, the min potatoes, is oil al shulchan malachim. Potato chips, even in the White House, isn't. What's the halach with potato chips? So the question is, do we look at the min potato? So this is included. Because it's a potato. Or do we look at the finished product and the potato chips is not oil al shulchan malachim? So this is part of a huge sugya because there are rayas on both ways. But at least I'm going to explain to you the different minhagim. Rav Moshe in Chelek Daled Mem Ches, as Rabbi Yakov and Emes Yakov, Yadei Har Mem Beis, and many others say that we look at the min and their rayas and basically potatoes oil al shulchan malachim. So therefore, even though potato chips is not, but potatoes are. However, there's a very thorough tshuva from Rabbi Belsky and Shulchan HaLevi in Siman Chaf Hey, and he's followed also the Marzal Yoel Chelik Beis Siman Mem, that say basically it's not mistavra to look at the min, because if this food is not oil al shulchan malachim and there's no chasnus, so why should things change just because the min is oil al shulchan malachim? And again, there are rayas on both ends. But I'm going to tell you right now that I am not qualified to pass. There's a global issue. You know, the Chazon and that tshuva about corn, or Chaim Simnun, he writes, "Ein b'yadeinu davar ein dateinu b'achras afilu das nemola." So what should I say? But all I could say is that I cannot paskin, but we saw, at least on my family, I told them, if our paiskim, Rabbi Moshe, Rabbi Yakov, Rabbi Shevet HaLevi Taka, and Rabbi Yasher has a tshuva also, and Asher Ish, that say it is, even though we have kashas on it, we follow our gedolim. But again, those that are mekel, they definitely have what to be saimich on, because in pashtus, you look at the finished product, not at the min. Now, lamaisa, the typically OU potato chips, whether it's Wise or Hera potato chips, the OU position is that we look at the finished product. So therefore, it is not Bishul Yisrael, but there's no reason for it, that's their position. What Rebelsky does add in that tshuva, that regarding Pringles, there's another tzad to be machbar. Because Pringles, how is it made? From powdered potatoes. How are powdered potatoes made? They first cook the potato, which is a regular bishul potato, and then they transform it. But the issur on heichal azal, once it was made a regular potato, it should be bishulakum. So he says, although they're starting to be mekel, but he says there's a machmat aval bracha regarding Pringles. So let me be clear, potato chips, there are two days, two minhagim. Pringles is more of a tzak to be machmir. Now, the last question I wanted to mention is potato peeler. This is fascinating how a vort makes a difference. Do you have to tevil a new, made by a goy potato peeler? And since it's almost Pesach, I'll mention also can opener and nutcracker. So listen how a vort makes a difference. The Yeridea Kufchav Sifei, the Shulchan Aruch says on a sakin shel shchit is machlokes, we have to make a bracha, you have to tevil it, even though it prepares food, but no one eats the meat after the animal is slaughtered. It has to be prepared. So this is a clear oichel that's not machshir achila right away. So the achra is you have to tevil the sakin shel shchit without a bracha. Because it's not machshir the oichel to eat, it's a first process. So based on this, we have three halachos. A potato peel that's only made to peel potatoes is like a sakin shel shchita, because no one eats raw potatoes. So you tevil it, like the Ramah says, beloy bracha, like a sakin shel shchita. A peel that's used for fruits or vegetable that are eaten as is, cucumbers or apples, you tevil with the bracha. A can opener, Zot Shleim Zalman, is machshir the can, not the food. It's called a can opener. So a can opener is potter from tevila. But here's the beauty. A nutcracker is which category? Definitely not a can opener. It's probably not a potato peeler. It's probably like a regular kiyachol. Because the truth is the whole nut with the shell is the food. Because no one said that the nut is muktzeh because the shell is muktzeh. The shell is part of the food. So taka the sefer tefillas kelim quotes up shleim zalman, and that's the Sambas Chaim says the same thing. That in a nutcracker you have to make a bracha on the tefillah. The Shevet HaLevi in Vav Reish Memei has this problem. He says to make a bracha, I'm not sure. At most, Tayla B'loi brachas, he considers the shell as a different part of the nut. But the Sambas Zalman Svar is very easy to understand. It's the whole food, and therefore Zicha Tayvel it, and probably with the bracha, I couldn't talk to you.
Same Egan Shirtar like to be a shehakol of Smith for today's shir. There's a Shem after Mincha of Smith will say a sikkim of the shir. Of the Ritzus is sponsoring a shir called Egan Shirtar 718-851-8651 or email ist@yeshivanet.com. And Andrew Ben Akasha Motz Vadish Baruch Hu Zakis is issur the figure Hibbel and Torah mitzvahs. And Hermal and Yakov and Sitka Yagdol Torah Liyadeh.
Amen.